the regeneration. Now, just to give you an overview of what we've done so far, I guess what we're trying to do is give as simple as possible, and I've found for myself it's really helpful to try and go through all the details of how all this works from the scripture, and it's challenging to do, to put all the different parts into it, and I'm sure I haven't got it all perfectly right. But I've found it helpful to put it all together to get a clearer understanding of what's going to happen in the lead up to Jesus' return, and then how he's actually going to set up the kingdom. So I've tried to do that by 3 nights. The first one was this timeline on when the events that would happen before Jesus returned, and then the events surrounding his return and our sort of judgment period, leading up to the events of Armageddon. Then in our last class, we looked at from the time of Armageddon, when that time of trouble, we called this session, the time of trouble such as never was, is going to be launched on the world, and Armageddon right through to all the nations being subdued finally. And we saw that all of these things are a process, and they take time, and it's even been suggested that perhaps this period from when Armageddon starts to when finally the nations are subdued potentially could take as much as 40 years to actually happen. So it's good to sort of get those things into our mind. And I guess what we want to do tonight then is look at, okay, Armageddon's happened, all the nations have been defeated. What happens from this point, from when Jesus takes control of the world? How does he then bring about this change in the world that he's going to bring about? And we've called tonight's class the Regeneration. And we looked briefly last week about where we got that from, because this is what Jesus calls this period of time, which is to come on the world. He says, "Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So Jesus calls this period of time of the kingdom to his disciples the regeneration. Can anyone remember what that word actually means? Sorry, before we do that and while you're thinking, I'm going to get someone to hand these out. Lawson, do you want to do that? These are just our little form. You can use them to fill in the verses just to help you remember them. Does anyone remember what regeneration means? I know everyone does, but just people are very shy. That's okay. Jack? A new start, yep. Definitely along those lines. Regenesis, exactly. The Greek word actually means regenesis, essentially. So what Jesus is saying is that he is going to, during this period of time, turn the world back into what it was at the time of Genesis. And that's going to take this process of time over the kingdom. And that's what we want to look at tonight, how he's actually going to do that during a process of time. Now, when people want change in government, usually the way people start is with new leadership. They think, let's turf out these old guys and let's get some new guys in that are going to set a new agenda and a new start. And I guess we've seen that the world has gone crazy with that in our country and in other countries, probably over the last 10, 15 years, in this pursuit to try and find someone who's actually going to be able to solve the problems. And then I think they just keep changing them to try and find someone who can actually step up to the task. Well, the first thing that Jesus is obviously going to do when he comes to power is set in place a new leadership. And this is going to completely set the tone for what is going to happen during the kingdom period. And he talks about this new leadership here. So the first thing is new leadership. And he's talked about that new leadership in that reading that we had tonight. And he talked about it in this verse which he told to the disciples. He said, this is going to be the leadership structure in the kingdom of God. He says, "Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory." So that's going to be the first change, is Jesus is obviously going to be king of the world. He is going to make all of the key decisions in the world. But he's not going to be alone in doing that. And he tells the disciples here that they are going to play a very key role also in the ruling of this new era for the world. They are going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So Israel is going to be reinstituted, well, they're already a nation, but reinstituted in the 12 tribes. And the disciples are going to play a key role in managing and looking after those 12 tribes of Israel. But that's not all. Because look what it says in Revelation chapter 20, that reading that we just read. In verse 4, it also describes that others will be involved. Verse 4 says, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed." So there's going to be other thrones as well as these 12 thrones for the tribes, for the disciples. These are who are going to be on the rest of the thrones. "Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life, and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years." So there's going to be this other, of course, group of believers, group of saints who will become fellow leaders with Christ in that kingdom. I must admit, when I read those verses, I got pretty intimidated, because I thought, look at the people that it describes who are going to be rulers with Christ. We're going to be standing alongside brothers and sisters who have actually been beheaded for the truth. Brothers and sisters who have lost their lives and the lives of their whole family in some circumstances in the Middle Ages to stand up for what God said was right. And God said, you are going to be with me, reigning with me on thrones in the kingdom of God. And I felt a little bit intimidated about perhaps what I'd been doing for Christ. And of course, every era is different and we face different challenges, but that's going to be where we are, ruling the world with Christ. Now, it describes a little bit about what we'll be doing, because verse 20 says, and we'll read it again, it says, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those with whom authority to judge was committed." Now, that word judge actually means to make decisions. So we're not just going to be with Christ as like sort of robots doing his service. We are going to be in key positions making decisions. And we're going to be spread across the world looking after, I believe, different areas of the world. Where do we get an indication that that's what's going to happen? Perhaps a parable, giving it away. That we're going to be looking after different cities. Anyone remember the parable? The parable of talents, or the parable of the pounds as well. I think one of the pounds is the one where he says you're going to look after the cities. But you remember, what he was basically saying in that parable was, today is a training ground for what you're going to be doing in the future. We're preparing all the things we do in the ecclesia, all the decisions that we have to make, the hard decisions sometimes that we have to make, and trying to work out and work with people. It's challenging, it's hard. And God says, I know it's hard, but it's because it's for a greater purpose. You're going to use those skills in the future. When I assign you to a different part of the world, and you're going to have a key responsibility to actually make an impact on that particular area, and you are going to have to make decisions. And you're going to be part of this new leadership structure that's going to look after the world. So you've got Christ at the top, you've got the disciples looking after Israel, and you've got all the rest of the believers who will be sent out into all different parts of the world. And I like to think, probably that maybe you go back, well, I hope not actually, that you go back to your hometown. That'd be really annoying, wouldn't it? You've been sent back to Melbourne of all places. Are you serious? Right? You go to like Heathmont, or you're sent to Ringwood. But who knows? Maybe we'll be sent to Noosa or a Greek island or something. Maybe they're the premium spots that people are going to get. But we'll be sent to make decisions and look after different areas in the world. And who will we be looking after? Well, we're going to be looking after the mortal population that still exists on the world. And the world is going to be full of people. And hopefully we've already seen that the purpose of God returning with his Son is not to wipe out the world. The purpose of God returning to his Son is to change the world and to convert as many hearts as possible. So that means that there's going to be billions of people, I believe, left upon the world. And they're going to have gone through this period, which was described last week as the time of trouble such as never was. People's lives are going to be broken. They're going to be wrecked. They're not going to know what the future holds for them and their families. And they're going to need people to come into their lives and to help them to rebuild and to be part of this whole new world that's going to come upon this planet. And we're going to be there to play that role for them. That's what we're going to do. Now, it is going to be different though. It's not going to operate exactly as it is today. And verse 1 to 20 describes that difference, particularly amongst the mortal population. He says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into a pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended." All right? So what we're told there, we're given this symbolic representation of what's going to happen amongst the mortal population, is God says, I'm going to take the dragon, and I'm going to take the devil and the Satan, the old serpent from the beginning, and I'm going to actually lock them in a prison so that they can't get out. That's what I'm going to do. Now, who is the dragon and the devil and Satan? Well, they're just personifications of sin, aren't they? The dragon's used in the book of Revelation as like a political entity, like kingdoms of this world that do as they please, and most of the time against what God does. And we know that the devil and Satan are used, and the serpent, right from the very beginning, are used as symbols, and the serpent, a literal creature who deceived other people to sin. God says, well, all those deceiving influences, I'm going to lock in a prison. In fact, the word is used, the same word is used of legion. You remember when he was locked in chains because he was so mental that he was going to hurt himself and other people? That's the same word that's described about what God is going to do essentially to human nature during this period. He's going to say, this 1,000 years is going to be different. Now, it's not like human nature and sin are going to be gone. They will still exist during that 1,000-year period, as they do today. But they're not going to be given free rein to deceive people. In other words, they're not going to be in areas of authority. We've already seen Jesus is going to be in authority, and the saints are going to be in authority. So they're not going to be in positions of power, and they're not going to be given free rein to deceive. And how is that going to happen? Well, we know that the saints or the believers are now going to be spread throughout the world looking after all these regions, and people won't be able to do whatever they please. And in that sense, sin is going to be in a cage and not able to have free rein. Now we're going to see that there's a little moment when that's going to be changed right at the end, but for the majority of the kingdom, that is what is going to happen, which will give God a much better opportunity to affect the hearts and minds of mankind, which is what he's trying to do. He's trying to affect people as much as possible. So, what's next? So that's the mortal population. That's the way the rulership will work. What about where we'll rule from? We're told that we're going to rule from the nation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Israel are going to be the main centre of the world. Here's what Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 17 says about Jerusalem. He says, "At that time Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord, and all nations shall gather to it, to the presence of the Lord in Jerusalem." So Jerusalem is going to be the key position of authority. That is where Jesus is going to reign from. It's going to be the very centre of the world. Now, when you look at the world, it's like a perfect spot if you were going to build a city to rule the world from, because look where it is. It's right here, right in the middle of the world. In fact, it's interesting, in Ezekiel, when Gog said, I'm going to go up to the land, the middle of the land of Israel, this land that's in the middle of the earth, that word actually means, describing the nation of Israel, it's actually the word for navel, right? the belly button. So Jerusalem's almost like the belly button of the world. It's like the very centre of the world. And what a perfect place for Jesus to manage all of the affairs that are going to happen. Now we will, I think, from what you read, we will, it looks like, be living in our area, all our different little zones, right, all around the world, managing our area. But we'll also be going back and forth between there and Jerusalem. Because in Jerusalem, if we zoom out on Jerusalem, we're told in parts of Ezekiel that there's going to be like a city that's specifically for believers. And it's like a government centre where we will come and go with the administration of everything that's happening. We will come and go and be involved in that place. In Zechariah, it talks about children running in the streets of Jerusalem. And many people have suggested, and I think it's a great suggestion, that perhaps we are centred here, and some of our children, if they're not baptised when Jesus returns to the earth, that they grow up in Israel and in Jerusalem, in that particular area, with us as we're managing this other role. Right? So that's an interesting thing to think about. So we are very much going to be a part of this area in Jerusalem. Now let's just turn to Zechariah chapter 14, because Zechariah, and there's heaps of passages on this, and we can only just touch on a few of them, but Zechariah says, and other passages say, that Jerusalem's going to be changed a lot from what it is today. Even though Jerusalem, if you've been to Jerusalem, is a beautiful place, and Israel is a beautiful place, but it's going to be transformed. And we actually touched on this last week when we looked at the Battle of Armageddon, and we looked at the earthquake that's going to happen upon the earth. The earthquake, particularly in Jerusalem, is going to make some major geographical changes. And we read about those in verse 9 to 11. It says, "And Yahweh will be king over all the earth. On that day, Yahweh will be one, and his name one. And the whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba unto Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hanel, and to the king's winepresses, and it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction, and Jerusalem shall dwell in security." So those verses describe this major earthquake, which is going to change the geography of the land of Jerusalem. And one of the things it says is it's going to be elevated. Now, Jerusalem's actually already on a bit of a mountain, but it says what the earthquake's going to do is it's going to push the city of Jerusalem way up into the sky. And it's also going to make some major changes to the actual land of Israel. And it's awesome to see what it's going to do, because we know that the land of Israel is a parable of our life, okay? You start here in the Sea of Galilee and you descend through the Jordan through your life, and then you end in death, right? And it's a depiction of our mortal life. But in the kingdom, God's going to change the nation of Israel to represent this new way of life that we're all moving towards. And some of us have already moved towards that, those who have been made immortal. So you're not going to be able to see this because I've used bad colours, but this essentially is what's going to happen. You probably didn't even see that, but let me just do it again. See? There? Now watch. You'll be so careful here to watch very carefully. There. Right? What a transformation. Well, it is a massive transformation, because what's going to happen is Jerusalem's going to be elevated hugely into the sky, and it says that what's going to happen is these living waters are going to be continually flowing out of that mountain of Jerusalem, and they're going to run down this mountain into the Dead Sea. Now, if you've been to the Dead Sea, you'll know that the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because it's dead. There's not one living thing living in the Dead Sea. But that's going to change. And the Dead Sea is going to become a living sea. And we're told that the water of Jordan is going to actually run back the other way. And it's going to run up here into the Sea of Galilee. And we're told that the water is then going to go from here out into the Mediterranean Sea. And so you'll have this continual cycle of living water which is going up and reversing that whole parable of our life. Okay? And we're told here that villages along the Dead Sea, which are now, if you go along the Dead Sea, like there's nothing growing, right? It's just desolate. You've never seen anything like it in your life. It's like another planet. But we're told that there's going to be fishing villages, and it's going to be alive along this Dead Sea. It's going to be completely transformed into that, like a different place. And Jerusalem will be this amazing city, and all the desert parts of Israel are going to be transformed as a result of that change in the geography of the land. And Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt. We read at the end of that verse that it said, it's never going to again see utter destruction. It's going to be a city that dwells in security for the rest of its existence. And there's passages in the prophets that say the people are going to help to rebuild the city, and not just going to be us, that all the nations are going to contribute riches and things like they did at the time of Solomon to rebuild that city of Jerusalem to where it is now. The other thing that's going to change is, as I said, Israel is going to be in the land. This is a famous map. You've probably seen it before. You've maybe got it in your Bible. It's like how the tribes of Israel will fit into the land. They're not going to be as they were before. They're going to run across here, horizontal, all the way up the land. And Israel will run from the Euphrates right up the top and right down to the Nile River. So Israel is going to span from the River Nile to the Euphrates. Can anyone remember where that was first mentioned in the Bible? That this land ultimately would go from the Nile to the Euphrates, the promised land. Well, it was Abraham, right back in the very beginning. God said, I promise you that you are going to live in this land and that you and your family will dwell in the promised land, and it will go from the River Nile to the Euphrates. And so that's going to come to pass, and Abraham's going to live there. He's going to be living there somewhere. You have a little plot of land, maybe Hebron or some key place in his life. He's going to live there, and probably a whole lot of other Bible characters will live in this area of Israel with these 12 tribes living. So Jerusalem will be at its centre. But there'll also be the temple, won't they, at the centre as well. There'll be the centre of worship, which will be the temple itself. And that's going to be built. Some people think maybe it'll start earlier, straight after Armageddon. But most people think it will be finally opened once all the nations have been defeated in the world. God will open this amazing temple. And again, it says in Isaiah that many nations will contribute to the building of that temple. They'll donate precious items and timber and all sorts of other building construction, just like they did to Solomon when he built the first temple back in the land of Israel. And it's going to be called a house of prayer for all nations. So this will be the centre of spiritual life for the world. So Isaiah says, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. There's certainly not one of them in the world today, is there? But in the future, there's going to be a house of prayer that all people are going to come to. And of course, this is the picture that we all probably think of when we think of that house of prayer. All right? This particular image of the kingdom. And if you don't know the history behind this image, it was actually drawn up by an architect over 100 years ago called Brother Henry Sully. And he was an architect, and he threw himself into the latter chapters of Ezekiel 40 to 48, which describe in detail this temple. And because he was an architect, he loved all the details of it, and he tried to work out what it might actually look like. Now, to a certain extent, the architecture that he's used is the architecture of the day, so we don't know if that's exactly what it's going to look like, and I hope it's a bit more modern in certain parts of it. But I can imagine it's going to be this unbelievable design that we're all going to contribute to and be a part of putting together this amazing temple that God has designed. I remember Uncle Phil Howe telling me, who came into the meeting from the outside, I remember him saying the first couple of lectures that he went to down in Hobart when he was first coming into the truth, he said, I remember seeing this image that they put up, and he said, I thought, oh my goodness, it looks like some kind of alien mothership coming down from outer space and landing upon the earth, right? He just could not understand what was going on. But of course, I think it's a great depiction. If you look more into the detail of what Henry Sully did, it gives you a great vision of perhaps what it could be like, and it's intended to help you paint your own vision of what it could be like in that day. Other thing I think is interesting about this, just from a modern perspective, I thought about this recently, is when you look at that building, it reminded me of another building, and this is the building it reminded me of. Does anyone know what that building is? That's Apple Park, right? I think it's the biggest building actually in the world, or maybe the Pentagon still is bigger than it. Or it's one of the biggest buildings in the world from an area point of view. Dad just looked at me and went like, you better check your facts on that one. Right, one of the biggest buildings in the world. But I thought that's interesting, isn't it? That this is like the pinnacle of man's technology. This building, where there was no expense spared, it was like the pinnacle of everything that man has done. And of course it's Apple, that symbol, the piece of fruit that's got the chunk out of it, which also, how did that logo come about? Right, that's from the Garden of Eden. And man always tries to replicate what God's going to do. But he never does it as well. He never does it perfectly. And God's going to build this amazing building that's going to draw all men together, not just for apps and streaming of technology, but house of prayer, that all men can come together and worship together. So that's the temple. Well, what about mortal life? What's it going to be like living on this planet as a mortal in that day? How is it going to be different from what it's like today? Well, one of the key things is, many verses say that there's not going to be the cities, the urban lifestyle which we have today. This is Revelation 16. It says, there was a great earthquake, such as was not since man was upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. The great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. So there is going to be a physical earthquake. This is also talking about a symbolic earthquake, a massive change in the way the world will operate. And one of the things that's going to be different is that we have a world that's not going to be dominated by man's worldly cities. It's going to be more of a rural lifestyle that man will live in. But there still will be countries. We're told that nations will still exist. In fact, it describes it as families, family groups will still exist. And they, of course, that's how nations have started, haven't they? There's areas of the world which were families that grew into nations. Those national groups will still exist. And that fits perfectly with what with what God told Abraham, wasn't it? God said to Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and your name is going to be great, and all families of the earth are going to come to know you and bless you. And that's what's going to happen. All the nations that exist, like Australia and India and China, all of them are going to retain their unique identity, but they're all going to change the way they operate and what's at the core of them. Let's just have a look at what the Bible says in Isaiah 65 about how life will change. Isaiah 65, verse 21 to 23. Reads like this: They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of the trees shall the days of the people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands, and they shall not labour in vain. So there's a description of what the world is going to be like at the time of the kingdom. And I love reading those verses because just when you start reading them, it's just such a more simple life. He says men are going to build houses, and they're not going to build. There's not going to be Metricon anymore. Men building hundreds of thousands of houses to house other people. Every man's going to build his own house. And he's going to live in his own house. And he's going to have his own garden and his own property to cultivate and grow. And he's going to grow his own plants and he's going to eat of his own plants. There's not going to be these huge supermarket chains, right, who take over the world, like Coles and Woolworths, where people are making food to make profit from other people. It's going to be a slower lifestyle. And it says people are going to long enjoy the work of their hands and they shall not labour in vain. And you know those verses reminded me of Ecclesiastes about what Solomon says the key to life is? He says, you know, people run around all their life, they're trying to get all this stuff, and we all fall into the trap, trying to get all this stuff and build up these things, and they just make their life so complex. Solomon said, what I found when I looked at life was the simple things in life. The time with family, sharing a meal with friends, enjoying the labour of your own hands. Those were the things that made life so enjoyable. And God says that's what's going to be at the centre of this new life in the kingdom of God. And it won't be a life of vanity, as he says in that verse. Like our life today often is, a life of vanity. It'll be a life lived with purpose. And these conditions are going to create contentment and actually a better way of living. We know, look what it says in verse 20 of the same chapter. It says, and no more shall there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the young man shall live to 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed. So life is going to go for longer. And that might be a contribution of the angels helping to unlock the most incredible diet, right, that we've been trying to unlock, that enables us to live longer. It'll be their assistance in helping us to avoid certain diseases and all those types of things, just as God did when he protected Israel in the wilderness. And it's going to result in a life of contentment for people that's going to be lasting and simple. That's what's going to happen. But it's still going to contain like unique nations who do things differently. We're not going to lose the different foods. In fact, they'll probably be enhanced because people have time to spend to develop these different things. And then at the heart of it all, this new mortal life is going to be this spiritual aspect to people's life. Let's just go to Isaiah chapter 2, while we're in Isaiah, where Isaiah talks about how the very centre of people's lives, much different to than it is today, is going to be God. Isaiah chapter 2, and these are very famous words that we've heard before. It says in verse 2, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established at the highest of mountains and shall be lifted up above the hills, and the nations shall flow to it, and many people shall come and say, 'Come, and let us go to the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us of his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the words of the law from Jerusalem.'" So out of Jerusalem, out of the temple, is going to go God's message to the world. And we're going to take that message out to the world, aren't we? Going back to Jerusalem, we're going to talk and work out how we're going to preach this word, and we're going to take it back to the world, back to the areas where we're going to live, and we're going to try and teach it to the people who live in the world at that particular point. And the passages go through, if you look at them all, and say, people aren't going to be accepting of that straight away. In fact, some whole nations are going to say, you know what, we actually don't want to listen to what you've got to say, and we don't want to go up to the festivals that we're supposed to go up to. And God is going to use elements of nature to convince them that they need to go and be part of what's going to happen. So there'll be some initial opposition to what happens. But you know what is going to happen as time goes on? As time goes on and people start to learn about God, and they see the type of lifestyle that it results in, they're actually going to start to see the wisdom of what God is all about. And I actually love these next couple of verses to think about this, right? You look at this verse in Isaiah 32, just beautiful words, right? He says, "Then judgment shall dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness remain in the fruitful field. And the work of righteousness shall be peace. And the effect of righteousness will be quietness and assurance forever. And my people shall dwell in a peaceful habitation and in sure dwellings and in quiet resting places." So what Isaiah is describing here is the righteousness, the right instructions and laws going out into the world and starting to affect people's lives. And he says when righteousness is established in the way people live, you know what it's going to start to bring about? It's going to start to bring about peace. It's going to start to bring about quietness. And it's going to start to bring about trust and insurance forever. And people are going to start to see that that's what's going to happen. Now, mankind has tried to pursue peace, hasn't he? It's not like man doesn't want peace or wouldn't like to live together. Man is always, even in our modern times, trying to come up with ways to develop peace. And so he develops the United Nations, where all the countries come together to try and work out how to have peace. In the Middle East, they're trying to work out and have for centuries how to get peace. People are always trying to work out how can we bring peace to our lives. And God says you're missing the key ingredient. And it's my ways. It's my teaching. It's my law. And when you take that on board and you start living it in your everyday, it's going to start having enormous positive results for mankind. And people are going to see it in their individual lives. And they're going to see it as countries and nations. And as a whole world, they're going to start to see it. Look what Malachi says about what is going to happen in the world, in all parts of the world. Eventually, when people see all of this starting to happen, he says, from the rising of the sun to the setting, my name will be great among the nations. And in every place, incense will be offered to my name, and a pure offering. For my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts. This is going to permeate through every city, every nation and every town and every home, until all men come to realise that God is great. And who thinks that today? Who even knows about God today? To know that he's great. It's less and less and less, isn't it? But eventually God says, don't worry. It's going to fill every home. And what an amazing time that'll be. No matter what city you go to, right? You'll get on a plane, well not a plane, with some kind of technology. You'll get on a boat and you'll go to another country and you'll go to another nation and you'll visit a family in China or over in America or over in Norway or Sweden or any parts of the world, and they're going to worship the same God that we do. And we get a taste of that, don't we, in our community. And it's awesome to go to a Bible school or visit a family on the other side of the world, and you instantly know about each other and you share God with each other. That's what's going to happen in all the world as man comes to see the wisdom that he's been trying to teach us from the start. He's been trying to tell us about his wisdom. And then people are going to come to Jerusalem. And those verses that we read in verse 3, look at the enthusiasm eventually that is in the world. Verse 3, and many people shall come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he will teach us of his ways and that we might walk in his paths. People are eventually going to get to the point where they can't wait to visit Jerusalem. And Zechariah says that every year, every family, no matter where you are in the globe, is going to be given a holiday to go and visit Jerusalem. Who knows how we'll get there? I'm sure there'll be modern technology, some kind of technology in the future that God will use. I was looking at the Noah's Ark. You know, that was something that God designed. You know what? Man didn't make a craft as big as Noah's Ark until 1850. So God knows how to make things and use technology. And he will in the future in ways that we don't even know yet. And we'll use that technology once a year to go to Jerusalem. It'll be like the most exciting time of the year as people make their way to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. And that will be the very centre of what people's lives are like. And what about environmental change? Well, there's going to be environmental changes that will come upon the world, won't there? This is what Isaiah 11 says. Actually, not this one. Actually, let's just quickly go to Isaiah chapter 35. A very famous passage which you'll know. It says, "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom like the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, and the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of God." So the deserts are going to be turned into places of fertile growth. And so it seems like the world is going to go through a similar, perhaps geographical change to what Jerusalem itself will be. And it's going to open up new areas of land to cultivate and work with. Perhaps a country like Australia will be opened up to have much more potential for the growth of plants. So that's what's going to happen. But I don't think it's going to be an instant thing either. You know the famous passage that says, "We will beat our weapons into ploughshares, into farming equipment." In other words, we're going to need to use the farming equipment upon the earth to actually cultivate the land and bring it back to its former glory. And I think that this will be a gradual process. It's not just going to be that we as the saints come in, like I said last week, with magic touch and we just, transform Ringwood into this amazing new place. It's going to be a gradual process that all of us are involved in. I remember watching this documentary a couple of years ago. I probably told plenty of you about it, but for some reason this stupid YouTube documentary left an impression upon my brain. It was called "If Humans Disappeared, What Would Happen to the Earth?" And it said, if tomorrow every human being just disappeared from the earth, how long would it take the earth to sort of be free from all of men's technology and all of the issues that he's made upon the earth? And whether you believe in climate change or whatever, there's no doubt man has mistreated and mismanaged the world. And it went through all the things. It went through a car and it said, if a car was just sitting there, right? And this will happen there's still going to be cars in the kingdom for a period of time. But it said after 100 years, a car sitting there, completely gone. Doesn't exist. And it went through all the structures and all the materials and the buildings in the world and how long it would take all these different things to slowly disintegrate and to be gone until the world was free, until it said it would get to a point where there was virtually unrecognisable as to there ever being man upon it. And it said it would take a period of around 1,000 years for that to happen, until the world was completely regenerated. And perhaps that same process will happen during that kingdom period as man works upon the earth and brings about the earth as God intended it to happen. Now, let's just go back to Revelation chapter 20 very quickly, because that period of time, obviously, the world is going to take this process of time to get to this point where the kingdom is running beautifully, and it will run for 1,000 years like that, men enjoying the kingdom together. But I think we also need to touch just very briefly on what's going to happen right at the end of that, because there is one final saga to happen before Jesus finally has completed this kingdom project. And it's in verse 7 of Revelation chapter 20. Oh, sorry, just before I do that, I just can't go back without saying this, because I forgot to say this. Right, I've got the picture there of the lamb with the lion with the lamb, you know, that famous picture, and that depicts what it's going to be like in the kingdom. I was like looking for that in the Bible, and it's actually not there. It's a wolf and a lamb, and it's a lion and a cow. Right, so whoever came up with that picture must have drawn the lion with the cow and thought, that's not working. It just doesn't look, you know, really cute and awesome. Let's try it. What about we try the lion with the lamb? They're in the same verse. And somehow that's become the famous image. It's not in the Bible at all. Right, so I just thought that was an interesting side note that I found. So the final rebellion. Let's just read 7 to 10, because this is going to be this final little rebellion right at the end of the 1,000-year period. It says there in verse 7, they said to him, because no one has... Sorry, I'm in completely the wrong chapter. Verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them to battle, for their number is like the sand of the seashore. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. So this is this final saga which happens right at the end of the 1,000 years. We're told that what's going to happen is this lock and chain in which the opposition to God has been housed, human nature has been contained, is going to be just unlocked for a season, it says. And we don't really know how long that is going to be. Perhaps we'll get more information about it later in the kingdom. Some have suggested maybe it's a period of 50 years. But it's going to be unloosed. And it seems like how that happens is the influence of Christ and the saints is going to be removed from the world, because it says that the saints are back in the camp, and the camp is their little home base back in Jerusalem. So they're going to retract to their home base to Jerusalem, and the world's going to be left to itself again. Now, it's interesting the way it describes that happening. It says it must happen. So we think, oh, this seems a bit annoying. The world's just got to the zenith and it's all beautiful. Why do we have to have this last little nasty bit that comes in the end? Because it must happen for the people during that period that they experience this final test. And they have seen all the awesomeness that God has had on display, but really, at the core of it, no different to what we've had displayed to us. And they'll then have to make a choice when the influence of God is gone. And doesn't it just illustrate that human nature is always going to be human nature? And God's going to illustrate that point as well, that it needs to be destroyed ultimately. Because very quickly, it seems that it goes back to start questioning God. And it says there's the ability to deceive. And so some people start saying, well, where are those saints gone? Yeah, I'm not so sure. And I always imagine, it's like, I'm sure you haven't even seen this movie, but in the 1970s, there was the movie The Planet of the Apes, right? And I remember in that show, it was like set on a world like far into the future. And they find on the ground one day, they find like the Statue of Liberty, it's just the top of it, and then they keep digging and they find the whole thing, and they find a subway in New York and stuff. And I always imagine that maybe that's what happens at this particular period. People start going, you know what, I've heard about the previous time when the saints weren't here. And then people had free reign to do what they wanted. And look what I've found. I found this coin or something from the past. And that spirit is going to grow amongst certain people until it grows into an enormous group of people. Not all. It says many people would be deceived by it. And there'll be plenty of people, and this will be the test, won't they, who will say, no, that's not true at all. This is what God stands for. And there's going to be this moment of testing for this generation to have to stand for God. But it says many will join, and they'll form Gog and Magog, right? The same characters as, man just keeps going the same process, doesn't he? and they're going to march down on Jerusalem. And it just seems so dumb, doesn't it? It just seems so stupid that they would do this again. But we know what that's like, don't we? Because we do the same thing over and over again in our own life. Because we've got this nature that has that tendency, and man will be the same, and they'll march down onto Jerusalem, and they'll come ultimately, it seems, to a pretty quick end, where it says that as they come to the edge of Jerusalem, God will from fire from heaven come down. Very similar description to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And finally, the rebellious nature of man will be completely destroyed, and there'll be no more opposition to God, but it will be an important test that has been exhibited. And then the last verses of Revelation 20 describe that there will be this second resurrection and judgment. And that's, of course, for all the people that have died during that second period of 1,000 years. And they too will have their resurrection, and they too will have their judgment. And finally, it says at the end of that judgment, in verse 14, it says this: "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each of them according to what they had done. And then death and Hades, or the grave, were thrown into the lake of fire." So finally, the last thing that's done is death. This thing that's haunted us right from the Garden of Eden is going to be thrown and destroyed completely, and everyone will be immortal upon the earth. And death and sin and human nature will be gone. And of course, we have those beautiful words about God being all in Corinthians, which summarise this whole thing beautifully when it says, "Then comes the end, when he, which is Christ, who's been so central to God's purpose, delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power. For he must reign until all enemies are put under his feet." And so he will do during that kingdom period. And the last enemy that is destroyed is going to be death. And when death is gone, when all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to him who put all things in subjection under him, that God may be all in all. And Jesus is going to hand back the finished project, isn't he, to God? God had intended right from the very beginning that what his plan was going to be was to fill the earth with his glory. And finally, that moment will come, and Jesus will hand back this completed project to God. So there it is. And we know that that's going to take a period of 1,000 years, and then who knows how long that little bit at the end of rebellion is going to take, maybe 50 years right on the end. That period of 1,000 years will be the development of this kingdom. And then, beyond, what's going to happen then? Well, let's just read, in conclusion, the first few verses of Revelation chapter 21. Because they're beautiful, really, and they tie the whole thing together. Revelation chapter 21, verse 1 to 4 says, "Then I saw a new heaven, and I saw a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people.'" And you know what? I've actually read the wrong verses. I was supposed to read Revelation chapter 22, even though those verses are beautiful as well as an introduction. Let's actually read the verses I was meant to read in Revelation chapter 22, where he says this: "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life." And this is the kingdom beyond the 1,000 years, when everything's perfect. "Bright as crystal, from the throne of God and from the Lamb. And through the middle of the street of the city, also on either side of the river, there was the tree of life, which its 12 kinds of fruits, yielding its fruit each month. And these leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And no longer will there be any curse. but the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And night shall be no more. They shall need no more lamp of the sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign with him forever and ever. And it's like the Garden of Eden, isn't it? The tree of life. No more curse. The regeneration of the world will be complete, and we will live with God and Christ as our home planet from that point forward. And who knows what's beyond that? We don't actually have much information. I like to think that at that point God says, let's just take like 1,000 years off, and you can just go and explore the universe for 1,000 years, and then let's meet back here at Earth and let's plan the next project together. Because that's what God does, doesn't he? He's always working on the next thing, to grow and to further his family. And of course, that's what we're going to be involved in. So hopefully, brothers and sisters, I found that to be so helpful for myself to look at it. And you know what, even to look at it in this period of the world where there's so much bad news going on. Like, it's hard to see any good news in the world. But this is the good news. This is what we're all looking forward to. The kingdom of God. It's going to be on earth. And we can look forward to that happening. So thank you very much for your attention.